it's absolutely marvelous to see so many people. As I say, it's a tribute to Emma's eminence and the sort of reach of her previous and present location. So she sent me kindly a blurb of what to say about her. As many of you will know, Emma is a senior lecturer in African Christianity and African Indigenous Religions, and is the co-director with Alex Chow, who many of you will know, a co-director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity at the School of Divinity at Edinburgh University. And it's you and Alex, isn't it, Emma, who co-edit Studies in World Christianity, the journal that Brian Stanley used to edit and that always publishes an issue of good papers from the Yale Edinburgh conferences, for example. Talking about recent publications, Emma didn't mention the only one I could get to hand, which was, again, on the theme, Relocating World Christianity, which she co-edited with Joel Cabrita and David Maxwell, Interdisciplinary Studies in Universal and Local Expressions of the Christian Faith, which is that one, which is a Brill publication. But also from Brill, and I must get hold of it still, coming out last year, was a Festschrift for Brian Stanley, Ecumenism and Independency in World Christianity, co-edited with Alex Chow. And of course, what Emma is talking about today is the monograph that came out sort of in the autumn, was it? You'll tell us a bit more.
Yeah, April.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Oh, right. Okay, I'm ignorant. I was only hearing about it in the summer from Brian, and I hadn't looked that up. Emma, in fact, has spoken at our seminar before about Apolo Kivebulaya, an aspect of his writings, and I have memories of his handwriting and yeah, and
you can remember more than I can, actually.
I didn't check exactly when it was you came and talked to us, but a little while back. And I was asking Emma, you know, when did you first get onto the life of this important Ugandan Christian? And she said she was first formally introduced to Apolo Kivebulaya at his graveside in 1993 in Boga in the DRC, because Emma had in an earlier incarnation worked in the DRC, and your PhD was on the Anglican Church in the DRC, from which there is a book as well. And she will say a bit more about how she got to work further on him. Interestingly, Emma's current research project is being done with colleagues from the Anglican University of Congo, going back, well, I mean, Kivebulaya works in Congo too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So her current research project is on belief in the time of COVID-19, examining trust and meaning-making around disease in the Democratic Republic of Congo with these colleagues, which sounds absolutely fascinating and obviously totally up to the minute. Okay, so it's now 20 to 6. So are you expecting to talk for about 40, 45 minutes, Emma?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, brilliant. And then we'll have hopefully about, can't do the maths, half an hour for questions and wind things up at about 7. Pardon? Can't hear.
No.
Can't hear. Maybe somebody needs to turn their...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wonder if we could ask everyone just to mute yourselves. We don't usually do this, but because there's feedback and we don't want to, just this once, would you mind to do that? with apologies. Unmute yourselves at any time you feel like bursting into song. Sorry.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Just before
Andrew Walls is here, guys.
Joking. Where?
No, he's just popping in.
Right.
Hello, Andrew Walls. Hello, Andrew Walls.
Yes.
Earth to walls. Well, how terrific. I can't find him on my list, but he must be somewhere. Right. Okay. So without further ado, to coin a cliche, what Emma's going to be talking about is let us now praise famous men. And unfortunately, they left the first quote mark off on our website, but writing the biography of African missionary Apolo Kivebulaya. So over to you, Emma. We look forward to this.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for coming and for the invitation from Debbie, Rosemary and Joe. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen now for some slides. Do please, if you want to ask a question as we're going along, since I know 40 minutes on Zoom can be more tiring than 40 minutes in person, do please try and indicate that and I'll try and look out for it as best I can. Otherwise we'll take questions at the end. Here is my PowerPoint. You'll just have to tell me whether you can see it. Is that visible to you, or are you getting my script as well?
No, that's visible, but can you just move it up to fill the screen?
Okay.
Yeah, it's only halfway down the page. There we go.
Is that it?
Well, you presumably don't want the stuff on the side.
No, I'll see if I can get the
Full page, however you do that. Fit to window, I don't know.
yes, just one minute.
Next to the green arrow.
Just finding the icon. There we go.
Praise be, that's wonderful.
Okay, thank you. So here is the book that I'm going to be talking about with some information for you, including the fact that it's an ebook and hopefully to appear in East Africa this year. It was delayed because of the pandemic. And also to say that I'm working on producing some of these sources in a volume as well, so that you can at some point check whether my interpretation has been correct in some of the things I say, but also these very valuable sources of Apolo Kivebulaya's that really illuminate so much and have been the basis for my books. But I want to start with this notion of biographies, because in recent years we've seen historians largely overcoming their previous aversion to biography, which was born of a concern about uncritical elements of admiration and the focus on a single individual rather than wider processes. And particularly in Africa, historians have for some decade used life histories to attend to the lives of Africans on their own terms. But often in these life histories, attention has been on those who are sort of representatives of wider groups rather than in some way unusual. And we've seen the Dictionary of African Christian Biography very successfully in the last 20 years or so, using the medium of biography to gather and to make accessible crowdsourced information on prominent African Christians. But it's perhaps worth noting that anyone examining mission history, as this group does, may want to retreat to past suspicion about biography, because in the annals of mission history, there's plenty of praise for famous men, usually white ones, and occasionally women too. And not only is that admiration often uncritical, but it can also be ahistorical. And I just picked two from my bookshelf. And here we have a Congo Pathfinder, W. Holman Bentley Among African Savages, and Alexander Mackay, missionary hero in Uganda. And, you know, again, these tropes come out. Sometimes the content inside is not too bad, but the publishers have insisted on a racy title. And here are two examples. So this idea of this ahistorical nature of some of these volumes, I'd like to clarify, because these activities of famous men, famous missionaries, do indeed take place in a particular context. And that context, which is often exotic or challenging or isolated in some way, as we can see from the picture of Bentley here, is important to understand the self-sacrifice of the missionary hero. But the focus on wider eschatological or salvific frameworks means that the narrative sometimes loses its moorings from social political habitus. And even if there's usually an absence of extraordinary miracles that are often found in the medieval stories of saints, the term hagiography often seems appropriate for the elevated esteem in many missionary biographies. And Apolo Kivebulaya, who's my subject, has also been the biographical subject of rattling yarns of daring do of the boy's own genre of writing. As a Black African, he's a relatively unusual subject of missionary biography, although there are quite a few others when you look for them. Albert Lloyd, his primary biographer, wrote 3 pacey books on Kivebulaya that are short on the kind of careful details that historians like, brimful of devotion to someone with whom he worked closely, and completely convinced that if only there were more people who followed the example of Kivebulaya, missionary work would flourish. And here you have a picture of Kivebulaya with Bishop J.J. Willis and Reverend Russell, and also just 3 of the about 10 published biographical accounts. Most of them follow Lloyd's approach, some of them very closely indeed. And there are also 3 unpublished biographies. But these biographical accounts are not all in English, and they're not all written by missionaries. There are at least 4 different languages. I'll say a bit more about them later. But as I approached writing this book, I felt keenly this double problem of biography, how to address the admiration of Kivebulaya's contemporaries and the following generations who continued to admire and praise him, and how to balance his apparent uniqueness with the way in which he represented in some way what was happening at his time. And the first problem, this admiration, this praise, has dogged me for some time, because Debbie's already referred to my first book about the impact of migration on church identity in post-independence Congo. And Kivebulaya kept appearing, even though he died 30 years before the period of my research. And I kept trying to sidestep his influence before it dawned on me that his esteem as the founder of the Anglican Church that was at the centre of my study was too profound to ignore, and might actually be saying something quite important. And Kivebulaya was also admired by his own people, the Ganda of central Uganda, and by Anglican members throughout East Africa. An admiration that has endured till today, although I'll say a bit more about how he's also been forgotten. So I'll come back to this question of admiration a bit later on, but the second problem, can the subject of a biography really be representative, was important for me because I'd come to the decision to write this book some time ago, as you'll have gathered from Debbie's introduction, as a result of my constant return to Kivebulaya and the sources that I'd first encountered in 1998 in Makerere University, when thinking about some of the common themes in world Christianity, so conversion, enculturation, translation, indigenous evangelists, and so on, and the fact that a good number of Kivebulaya's documents had been preserved and interviews had been carried out with those he trained in the 1950s, meant that I had an excellent set of primary sources on which to draw. And this when Kivebulaya's contemporary church workers often have no historical paper trail, or very, very, very little and fragmented. But then the question is, how representative were his sources of what were going on elsewhere, and how much was their preservation somehow tied up in Kivebulaya's standing as a famous man? As I say, I'll return to this question of admiration later, but I'd like to answer this latter question about representation by way of an intro to Apolo, for those of you who haven't met him, haven't heard me talk about him before, and an explanation of how I've written about him and the religious encounter and social change, which is the subtitle of the volume. So Kivebulaya, this is oops, going too fast. This is kind of this is the table of contents of my book, and you'll see chapters 2 to 7 pretty much take a straightforward progression through his life. He was an Anglican church teacher and then an Anglican priest from the Buganda kingdom of central Uganda, who was hailed as a missionary in the Ituri forest, particularly to the Mbuti hunter-gatherers or pygmies. And in these chapters 2 and 3, what I try to do is illuminate Kivebulaya's early years. So from around 1865 or maybe 1870 to 1895, as he moved from the rural area of North Singo, where he was born, to the capital of the Kingdom of Buganda, and also as he moved from indigenous practices to some encounter with Islam and then to Christianity. He did so during the civil wars of 1889 to 1894. And I found this chapter perhaps the most challenging to write. There's a great deal of excellent scholarship on the pre-colonial Ganda kingdom, for which I'm profoundly grateful. But there's a tiny amount of information about Kivebulaya's childhood and youth, which all took place some distance away from the courtly activities that have been the subject of much of the scholarship, although we see that changing. And we often see this, that African Christian biographies say little about the background of the person, and now I kind of know why this might be. But I wanted to present some plausible historical account of Ganda society in which Kivebulaya grew up. I felt this would enable me to work at some of these power dynamics which continued into the colonial era, although they were changed and adapted. And it would also enable me to present a rationale for why Christianity was particularly attractive at this time. The speed with which the Ganda people became Christians was quite noticeable and quite different from other parts of the African continent. I also wanted to see how the initial success of Islam influenced this historical progress. Kivebulaya certainly came into contact with Islam, and I write about that. And it seemed important to place Kivebulaya in his pre-colonial past to identify the continuities with that, even though he was a person who saw a distinction and change and newness as being very, very important. And in chapter 3, I try and personalise the process of social religious change during this period of political upheaval around the civil wars. The civil wars in the Kingdom of Buganda, but also the wars against Bunyoro. And during this time, we see Kivebulaya finally casting his own identity as Muganda and Protestant. And I think it's very interesting to see how he had some connection with Bunyoro, that became known as the enemy, and kind of disassociated himself from that. And in doing this, he was joining a political force that was to be influential in the development of the colonial protectorate of Uganda. And no doubt his contact with the famous men like the two I have in this picture, the First Minister Apolo Kivebulaya and Apolo Kagwa, and the chief and moderniser Ham Mukasa, who's the slightly shorter chap, was really influential in his initial understanding of what Christianity was. Ham Mukasa was his godparent or sponsor, and one of the interesting things is that one of the adopted families of Kivebulaya maintains a close relationship with Ham Mukasa, even across national boundaries, and this was kind of one of those kind of neat little things that I discovered as a result of a number of conversations when I was in Kampala a few years ago. These families were still communicating, still supporting each other, still helping each other, and very much saw this relationship between Mukasa and Kivebulaya as part of this kind of patronage that continued. But although there is an element in which Kivebulaya is developing these opportunities for himself as someone of peasant stock by relating to the Protestant Ganda elite, he's also complicating this narrative and enabled me to kind of decenter these political power brokers and see what else was going on. It's possible that Kivebulaya was enslaved. This is one of the things as I try and explain the situation, I explain why I think that's a possibility, but we certainly don't know for sure. What we do see is that Kivebulaya's conversion took place in various stages, and at each of these stages we see aspects of self-making or deliberate changes and choices in his situation. The evangelical expectations of reading the Bible, of following Christ, of praying, and so on, were effective resources for life, and there was a real moral obligation developing at the time to share them. And so we see Kivebulaya remaking himself as an individual. He's loosening his ties of kin and clan. He's rethinking or remaking himself, what it means to be a man at this stage. And yet he's doing these things in order to form new ties with Christian kin and create a wider community. And this becomes important not only in this part, but as he goes to Toro, when it takes some time, but he begins to distance himself, or his actions distance him from the nationalist and ethno-nationalist identities that the elites are developing, and he develops a much more transnational view of Christianity that goes beyond national borders, and this strikes me as quite important. So the kind of middle two chapters deal with his time in Toro. Within months of his baptism, Kivebulaya volunteered to be a missionary in this kingdom, which you can see on the map, and you can also see some of the places in Ituri that he visited. He spent 20 years there between 1895 and 1915. He was already visiting Mboga during this time, spent periods of up to 6 months there, but was considered to be based in Toro. And what I try and do here is explore some of the elliptical relationships and exchange of ideas between European missionaries and African church teachers and the court of Kasagama, between mission stations and villages, and show how Kivebulaya became a respected member of an emerging clerical group that promoted Christianity as a means of political cohesion. But as I kind of noticed before, he didn't quite fit with the developing clerical norm, because his lifetime commitment to itineration and church planting and these brokership of novel ideas began to feel quite different through these decades, as increasingly church leaders began to settle down. Perhaps they were church evangelists for a relatively short space of time, or perhaps they became clergy, but this constant itineration at the beginning of this 20-year period began to be much less likely among church leaders, and it's something that he continued throughout his life. And we see him introducing novel technologies, new codes of behaviour, articulating them through local idioms, working out how to balance the traditional expectations of well-being with the new forms of spiritual expertise that he was bringing. And this power and attraction of new things and ideas that I refer to as novelties is an important concept for comprehending the change that Kivebulaya espoused. Now, I don't know whether you can see a strange pop-up on my screen. Is that visible to you? No, good, because I can't get rid of it.
Oh, the little map, you mean?
No, there's some antivirus thing that's just popped up that I got. That's good.
We've just got 2 maps.
Good. In the last 18 years of his life, from 1915 to 1933, Kivebulaya based himself in this Ituri region, at the other side of kind of Lake Albert and the Semiliki River. And I don't have time to kind of describe to you. This is really quite dramatic landscape. You know, you've got the Ruwenzori range there, but Toro is on quite a high plateau with lots of hills, lots of volcanic hills, all of which have resonances with Toro beliefs and practices and their mythology around their hero gods. And then you descend very rapidly to the plain, to the Semiliki plain, and cross this savannah, and then you go up a very, very steep escarpment to Mboga. And I travelled this way a couple of times myself, in a little more comfort than Apolo Kivebulaya would have done, although still with a dug-out canoe and on the back of a motorbike. But, you know, I always think about this kind of landscape and some of the kind of challenges that the terrain presented to him and to the groups of people who walked with him as I write some of this. And I had to cut some of my perhaps more florid descriptions, geographical descriptions, out of the book to save it costing even more than it already does. But what's interesting is that this kind of landscape really lends itself to these ideas of isolation, although we need, and remoteness, although we need to be wary of those, because of course places are never remote if you actually live in them. They're home, but nevertheless, Ganda, who looked to Ituri, and there had been trade links, ivory and rubber trade links into the Ituri forest. Slavery routes generally didn't pass that way. But, you know, it was seen as this kind of foreign place, and there's plenty of writing which is quite pejorative towards the people who live in the forest, but in some of the Luganda journals. So he makes quite a statement, a deliberate statement, by saying he'll return to Mboga, which is now under the control of the Belgians. It had been nominally British for a few years before the borders were properly drawn up or completely drawn up. But he although he's going to an area considered remote, he still saw his work as part of a global network of missions to all nations. And so, yes.
Emma, sorry, while we've got the maps here, can you just tell this ignoramus where then would count as Buganda? We've got Bunyoro, Ankoli, Toro. So Buganda itself on that little map is kind of Kampala and...
Yeah, Kampala, Entebbe, Masaka, that area, and then round, I can't quite see it all, rounds, Ginger is Busoga. So it's a kind of arc up towards Lake Albert. It's in that kind of arc. Sorry, I do have another map, but I don't think I could bring it up quickly. But
so Buganda, where he's from originally, is basically southeast of Ankoli and Bunyoro. On the left-hand map, we've got Ankoli, Bunyoro.
Okay, yes. So you can see on the larger map where he originally comes from something that's to the kind of east of what's on this map, but close to the Bunyoro border. And in fact, it was in Bunyoro before the Baganda kind of conquered that area. So that's where he's from, and then he's moving west. So the distance between Fort Portal and Kampala is about 200 miles.
Right. Yes, because that was going to be my next question. What sort of distances, apart from the difficulty of the terrain and the mountains and the river that you need your canoe for, what sort of distances does he travel?
Yeah, I mean, it's not huge distances, although he does do most of it on foot. It's only in his latter years that he has a bicycle from 1913, which he can't use everywhere. And then he does get lifts in vehicles from the 1920s, mid-1920s onwards. And we see all this in his diaries. But
did he ever travel on animals, or do people not do that in Buganda?
Not really very often because of the sleeping sickness, the tsetse flies.
The animals would get sick.
Yeah, so there's plenty of cattle, but there aren't horses, for example. Yeah, and so he tends to do a lot he does an awful lot on foot, and in Mboga, he has a kind of 60-mile radius from Mboga, so it's kind of it's 3 days march. That's the kind of area that he's working in around Mboga. So he
the 18 years at the end of his life.
Yeah. So he may have got to Beni, but he wouldn't have got any further than that. On this map, he does get up to Getty. He has to go to Urumu because that's the colonial base at the time. But it's these areas around Mboga, Kainama, Bwakadi that he's visiting regularly. Yeah, and I think one of the things, perhaps I can show you a picture if the map is clear. Here is a picture probably taken by a missionary called Schofield in the mid to late 1920s, where he's teaching a group of forest people. They're kind of clustered around. But what we see, I think, is that he's kind of developing his missionary techniques in this. He's in some ways repeating what he's learned, but he's having to adapt in what is for him a more hostile arena, because it's much politically, it's much less accommodating. He's much more suspicious. He's not a member of, vis-a-vis the Belgian authorities, and they hold him to account. He has to account for his the church workers, the young people who start working with him. After the Kimbangu trial in 1921, there's a kind of edict that goes out. We must, clamp down on all this kind of independent work. And there's actually some very odd story, a source of somebody being beaten for preaching, being beaten to death for preaching, and that person's followers come and join Kivebulaya. So much more I'd like to know about that story, but I suspect we never will. But he's under this kind of surveillance, and it makes a big difference. And at least one of the Ganda who he worked with seems to have fallen out with the Belgian authorities and gets sent back to Uganda. And it's quite, when you read the archives in Brussels, there's real anxiety and hostility vis-a-vis British influence, and the Ugandan archives are kind of similarly wary. But what we see, go back to that one. What we see is Kivebulaya still being influenced by his Protestant Uganda and British background. These things don't leave him, but they are shaping his particular form of cosmopolitan international Christian sociality. So, trying to figure out and explain these nuances of how he was relating in this area and his concerns around the Belgian authorities, and yet also his recognition that he had to conform to their expectations if he was going to stay there, are very apparent in the archives. But what we also see, and this is a question about sources as well, is an apparent increased dependence on the display of spiritual expertise to show divine power, and this is something that the oral testimonies also pick up, although he is, it's not something that he talks about too much in his own accounts. And then this kind of developing of close relations to young people that became the next generation of church leaders in the new village churches, and his interest in the Mbuti. I mean, this has sort of been overplayed by previous biographers, and I might have downplayed it, but again, sources were limited here. But he certainly did have a different approach. He saw the Mbuti as hunter-gatherers, of needing kind of special treatment, and the expectations. He wasn't expecting them to settle down or to attend school, and his poor church teachers had to go and live with the Mbuti and follow them round as a part of their itineration, and they didn't much care for it. So that makes kind of interesting reading in the sources. And here he is with a group of forest people, and there's all sorts of things we can say about his dress, which I've written about. I want to come on to chapter 7 though, and say something about his impact on British missionary supporters and the Buganda Church, because I was wanting to kind of get these connections from the locality where he was to the connections, the networks that he had, and how he maintained those. And I think we can't really understand Kivebulaya without analysing his trans-regional connections and aspirations that were contained in his particular missionary vision. And the word missionary was used of him at the time. It was the term for those people who worked outside the region of origin. And he saw himself as a missionary, and so did his fellow workers, whether they were white or black. And so, you know, we've often gone round this issue in scholarship of referring to white missionaries and black or indigenous evangelists and the problems of it. But in Kivebulaya's times, these were not deliberately racial categories. And I think this kind of brings me to another part of the book that was tricky to write, partly because I found some of the sources rather late on in my research. But that was his relationship with other Europeans, or with Europeans. And many people have said how relationships between Africans and Europeans became increasingly unequal as colonial power became more invasive. And social Darwinism became more influential. And we certainly see these influences in the Great Lakes area. And there are plenty of opportunities to discuss what I call these asymmetries of power. But what I tried to get at was the way in which Kivebulaya and his CMS colleagues had different forms of influence that they leverage in certain ways. At the end of his life, he uses his status as admired elder to tell congregations and schoolboys to work in harmony with white people, for example. And these ideas of power dynamics are related, of course, to agency. And we can see that agency is emerging through the interaction of actor and the wider social setting. And so I think these questions about how far Kivebulaya, like other Africans in the colonial era, was constrained by their situation and yet found new strategies, found new opportunities and solutions to constraint, comes up time and again. But I think we can also see that in his relationships with white missionaries, there are situations in which his agency is greater than theirs or differently configured from theirs, making these kind of African-European binaries around agency and power much less stable. But also his ability to act reflexively in his context and manipulate the increasing influence of white people for his own ends at times also makes him less able, I think, to see the debilitating change in power dynamics at the end of his life. And so he sounds a bit like a grumpy old man, I think, in some of these older, in these sources, you know, telling off the young men. And, you know, I think we could leave it at that in some ways, except that the rhetoric of those sources in his later life comes out among East African revivalists. They also are talking about racial harmony and how to get on with white people, although, of course, as you may know, they also tell white people to confess their sins of racial superiority, and I'm not sure Kivebulaya ever did that. And I've called this these notions of racial harmony that come round the modern missionary movement intent, that there's a unity that is beyond temporal power and beyond earthly differences of language and ethnicity, a grammar of similarity. And I've chosen that term because Stoller and Cooper have identified this grammar of difference that arises in colonial situations between colonizing powers and people and their colonized people. And I do think that there is this work of this grammar of similarity that Kivebulaya is really interested in, and that's taken up much more strongly in the movement that really gets going as he is dying. So this is at the centre of his admiration, this holding on to this unity and this Christian unity. And I'm coming on to this admiration part as I promised, but what I hope I've done just here in this introduction to the book and to Kivebulaya has been to sort of begin to answer my second problem question about representation. I think, sorry, I've just lost my notes, as you do. I think what I want to say about Kivebulaya is that he was unusual in degree, but not fundamentally in his behaviour, that his lifelong commitment to being a missionary and his dedication to the task was unusual. But there were a good many people, Ganda, Toro, Ituri people, who spent shorter periods preaching, teaching, translating the Bible and training the next generation. And quite a lot of them feature in my book, and I'm sorry I haven't got time to introduce you to them as well, because they were the mentors, friends, colleagues, pupils and adopted children of Kivebulaya. And so it's his exaggerated behaviour, if you will, that allows us to see clearly the kind of social changes that were happening, perhaps more broadly and more subtly elsewhere. So to the question of admiration, and I am kind of getting towards the end of what I'm saying, obviously when praising famous men was part of the biographical task, this was precisely what biographies were meant to do. And it's certainly, as I said earlier, something that's come up in Apollo's biographies. But my aim to write about Kivebulaya as one who could illuminate wider concerns in the scholarship of African history and world Christianity, admiration had to be investigated if it were not to become quite a significant problem, a kind of elephant in the room. And I want to say that during the research, it became clear that admiration was expressed in plays and songs as well as biographies. And there's this corpus of oral, performative, visual and educational forms of admiration in at least 3 other languages apart from English. And I've got some of them here for you as well. So not only is he somebody that British people should follow, but he's an exemplary churchman and founder of the Eglise Anglicane du Congo. So this is the stained glass window in Namirembe Cathedral in Kampala, and you see him up at the top. That's Apollo surrounded by Mbuti pygmies. And here you have Kwaimani Apollo, which is the Congo Swahili version of his biography. And here you see that, to celebrate, this is a stamp, and you see it's a Tanzanian stamp. Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda all have the same stamp to celebrate the centenary of the Anglican Church, or the arrival of Christianity, in 1977. And who do they put on their stamp? Not a Uganda martyr or anyone else, but Apolo Kivebulaya baptizing. So, you know, here you have this clergyman. Here you have a very rainy picture of Kivebulaya Road in Kampala. So road signs, church signs, you see them about the place that say Saint Canon Apolo Kivebulaya Church or school. And here is the most recently produced A-level text for Christianity, because he pops up all the time in textbooks, religious studies textbooks, from primary right through to A-level, and he's the most cited person. He's cited more often than the Uganda martyrs, for example, and they are very big in Uganda and have their own special day. But Kivebulaya is important here. To kind of condense what I think is that there's an official memory of Kivebulaya that's contained in literate forms of memorialization by clergy, by revivalists, by educationalists, and by the international missionary movement. And I think in a country where pages were killed for disobeying Mwanga and the king in 1885, 1886, these people are venerated as martyrs. The key facts of Kivebulaya's life were promoted to make ordination and missionary service part of a more attainable model of self-sacrifice than martyrdom. Now, different groups within East Africa and British Anglicanism have different emphases around this common focus. And under the subheadings of church founder, missionary, Muganda, clergyman, proto-revivalist, and international missionary, I explore some of these distinctions in that first chapter that I've called The Afterlife of Apolo Kivebulaya. And we can see that some of the early biographical accounts in Luganda, there's a published one and an unpublished one, can be read almost exclusively through the framework of a Buganda or Ugandan historiography. Others are using him to critique this kind of more ethnocentric view. Memories of Kivebulaya helped evangelical Christians in East Africa and in Britain to envisage their place in wider society, to evaluate their present and to imagine the future. And so we see the production of stories written about him reflect an attempt by a number of overlapping communities to lay claim to him and to his memory. And in doing so, he kind of operates as an ideological link between those martyrs and between the revivalists who come next. And that came through in some of the interviews I did. People put him in a kind of trajectory. And, you know, he becomes part of this social imaginary, as we've often called it, of the Anglican Church in the Great Lakes region, and also among a previous generation of British missionaries and their supporters. But this dominant narrative is somewhat challenged by a kind of oral narratives that come through, the kind of things that I first encountered in 1993 in Mboga, and also in these transcribed oral testimonies that were taken in the 1950s, where there's a much greater emphasis on kind of miraculous power. There's rainmaking and there's cursing of a local chief, prayers and prophecies against chiefs that are absent or muted in other documents, including in Kivebulaya's sources, although he does mention them occasionally, and so there's some healing narratives as well. And I think what we see is a real tail-off in the 1960s, and it's quite interesting that, at least in British missionary writings, he does continue into the 1960s. He makes it into John Foster's TV accounts of, you know, famous men and a couple of women of the late 1960s, for example. But obviously, biographies that present Saint Apollo as a missionary model for British Christians diminished in popularity along with imperial travel stories and other missionary literature. And nationalism and indigeneity were the politics of the present, and there was much more attention to founders of African initiated churches, been once regarded with suspicion. I imagine this audience knows all about that. But he continues to live on in the memories of people in Congo and in revival and in school classrooms, so that despite a decline in the Great Lakes region of the aesthetic revival values that I think he kind of encouraged, or was a kind of connected with in some way, despite this decline in favour of a contemporary Pentecostal spirituality broadly, or charismatic spirituality, we still see Kivebulaya popping up. And I thought I would leave you with an article that kind of bridges this older memory that keeps popping up with perhaps something of a new charismatic flavour. Because I found an article in a Ugandan magazine in 2005, written in 2005, in which Kivebulaya is no longer described as a sober, self-denying clergyman, as in lots of these published sources, but as a powerful wonder worker. The article in question was written to celebrate John Sentamu's enthronement as Archbishop of York. Now, Kivebulaya taught Sentamu's grandfather, and I have that from Sentamu himself, and therefore this story is an account, a apparently given by his son. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to ask Archbishop Sentamu whether he thinks this is, you know, how far he goes along with this story. But we see that in this article, the story in this article, Kivebulaya prophesies a clerical dynasty that Sentamu fulfills along with his two brothers, who are, you know, pastors in their own right in Kampala and in the US, or were. Sentamu's father, John Walakira, as a young boy, witnessed a great storm over Namirembe. Kivebulaya calms the storm with Christ-like authority when he lifted up his arm and boomed mightily, "Peace, be still." Overawed, Walakira knelt before Kivebulaya, who prophesied, "Your children will be preachers unto the ends of the earth." And so here we see, as I say, something quite distinct from the printed sources. And as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen any other calming of the storm stories of Kivebulaya. So a lot of the stories that you see kind of repeat themselves in different sources, but not this one. So this kind of a new Apollo story, and this idea of Kivebulaya as a prophet comes through in oral testimonies, but it was the first time I'd seen it in a written testimony. So to conclude, I found a really helpful quotation written by Carl Walraven in a book that came out just as my book did, called The Importance of Biography in African Historical Studies. And he talks about good contextual biography being rooted in ideas and events larger than the persona, that it's a dialectical relationship of the individual with multiple social, cultural and political worlds, which the subject inhabits and helps give meaning to. And so the subject of contextual biography is not the complete person nor the society, but the point at where the two meet, an interplay of personal and interpersonal forces. I'll let you decide how successful I've been in that, but what I've hoped to do in taking a biographical angle has been to use as effectively as possible those archives available to us that place an African actor at the centre of the inquiry, where often the sparse sources, or the sources that are difficult to find, have caused African voices to be sidelined. I hope you see an intimate way of scrutinising the internal rationale and the historical impact of particular religious change. I haven't spoken very much about attending to the interiority of motivations, aspirations of prayers or visions, but these are some of the themes I pick up as I go along, as well as this examination of new social bonds and obligations and responsibilities between Christians. But I hope that in examining these themes in the life of one person and his associates, and they are very important, we get an interaction of the themes that are often examined separately, that we can track their intersection and chart their development through the events of an entire life. And I hope that in choosing someone who appears extraordinary in their commitment to the movement, but in actual fact can be seen to illuminate most clearly some of the social change and the religious encounters that were occurring at the time, that I have been able to make a contribution to the growing historiography of the role of indigenous Christian agents, including those who were missionaries, and the history of the Great Lakes region in Africa. Thank you.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Emma. I know we've got a number of people here who themselves have written biographies, whether of African Christians or white missionaries. So there's a lot of interest in biography in general. And I personally, having worked a little bit on Seth Mokatimi, the Methodist, first Black president of the Methodist Conference in South Africa, about whom I have also read the kind of admiration and praise sort of literature you refer to. So for me, your general comments about biography were incredibly helpful and insightful. What we're going to do is have a combination of questions verbally. I'm not sure if David Maxwell's big yellow hand is a sign that he wants to ask a question. That's very helpful. I'm just going to abuse my position by asking a couple of things to start with. If Emma, should we take, once I've asked my couple of things, should we take a couple of questions at a time verbally?
I'm happy to do whichever way you
could see how that goes. And if you're finding it difficult to get a word in edgeways, you may want to put something in the chat box, and Joe Davis will try and keep an eye on that as well. So I just had to ask, because I can't remember from when you talked to us before, was Apolo married? I sort of think he wasn't. I remember you talked to us before about the unusually good written sources that you had, some in the vernacular. And I would love you to tell us a bit more about the pros and cons of the sources, and are they, as one imagines, actually quite unusually prolific for this sort of person? And thirdly, you said you were giving us an idea about motivations and aspirations and social change and religious encounters. And my feeling was, I still didn't really know why he'd gone to the Pygmies. How much idea do you have from his writings about what inspired him? Does he talk about it much? But he stuck at it for such a long time. He's presumably having to work in their language. What were the sort of challenges of that? And that would be part of the social change and religious encounters that we haven't really heard about because there was so much else to say. So that's a bit of a raft of questions. Then we'll have David and John, and then we'll have Ali and Michelle. Okay. And there may be people on my other page that I can't see, but that's where we'll start. Okay, thanks, Emma.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try and answer them quite quickly. No, for a long time I thought Kivebulaya wasn't married. In actual fact, he was married briefly around the time that he was reading for baptism, and his wife died. But often the CMS sources talking about him not being married. I mean, he wasn't married in church, but he had the words in Luganda mean, he was properly married. And it is very unusual that he didn't marry again, and people don't speak a lot about it. But he kind of talks about being married for Christ to one of his church teachers, who writes about him afterwards, unpublished. Sources, I think when I first came across the sources, I thought they were utterly amazing and unique. I think, that was 1998, and since then, other people have found really, really good sources as well. But they do seem to fit a type. I mean, of course, there was this flourishing of literature in Luganda at the time. So he's certainly not the only person who was writing. Lots of people were writing. And, he wasn't a man of letters. He wasn't doing this cultured writing of Kagwa or Mukasa, these guys. He was jotting things down, noting things down. And one of the kind of fun things was working through the 3 extants, jotters or diaries, that he kept, that are wonderful in their own right, because it's difficult to know where they begin or end. Things are not putting in any chronological order. there's more than one hand, there are several versions of the same story. There are aid memoirs, little notes, all sorts of things are in these books. And
are the books in a church archive, or?
They're in Makerere, so
Right.
they're all in Makerere archive, which is fabulous. I mean, one of them is a facsimile, but this work was done in the 1950s, and it's great that it was. Why the Pygmies? I mean, I think there was Kivebulaya, part of this transnational thing was that he very much took on this missionary mantle, and one of the things was, these chain of mission stations across Africa and that kind of thing. The fact that Africans were better at evangelism than missionaries because they understood the cultural context and all that. And he was very much involved in that. And the hunter-gatherers were people who were particularly difficult to reach in missionary terms. And so this is why he gets so much attention when he manages to reach them, and the Catholics are a bit jealous. And so, there's a kind of a bit of a rivalry going on here. And he really puts himself out there, and people are very impressed by the way that he appreciates the Mbuti lifestyle and tries to spend time with them in their own following the way that they live and eating their own food. And when I say people, I mean like the neighbouring people. His the folk from Mboga who travelled with him, these young guys, found it incredible that he would eat pygmy food. So we got lots of kind of hierarchies there going on amongst the
Mboga youth wouldn't do that.
No. I mean, this was one thing that was remarkable. This was why he was a special person, because of what he would go to the Walesi, he'd go to the Mbuti, and he'd go and sit with them, and he'd spend time with them. And this was the challenge he put down to those people who followed him and wanted to be church teachers, that they also had to do this.
When you were talking about the missionary mantle and the chain of stations across Africa, so is that in the Black leadership, or is that partly from the CMS missionaries? I mean, are the CMS missionaries keen to reach the Pygmies but frustrated?
Yes, I mean, if you like, it's an international sharing in the modern mission. We get it in the faith mission churches, and we get missionaries exchanging these letters.
I'm sure when I was going to Scripture Union in Cape Town, we had heroic stories about reaching the Pygmies. Yeah.
Yeah. This kind of thing, and meeting in the middle, the Congo forest was the middle where west and east coast could meet, and all this kind of thing. So he gets picked up, and I think there's more work that could be done in following, a Kivebulaya trail through international missionary sources. I haven't attempted it really.
Yeah. Shame. I must move you on to the other people. What else had I asked? Maybe we can just skip.
Yeah, well, we can come back to it. It was about language, I noted it, but...
Right. So David and John, if you can maybe just briefly say what you want to say. They may be very different, but then it may help us move forward.
Thank you very much, Emma, for an enjoyable, very interesting talk. You've spoken a lot about Kivebulaya's writing, but I wondered whether you'd been able to reconstruct what he was reading and whether and the washback of what he read. So did he, in his writings, his articles, his diaries, poems, deploy stereotypes and tropes of otherings, particularly about pygmies, that missionaries so much loved to deploy, pagans? When he trekked, did he deploy tropes about traveling into pristine regions beyond to enact the Acts of the Apostles? So did he deploy these othering tropes, but did he also perhaps borrow the grammar of similarity from what he read? Yeah, that's just the question. Curious to know whether you can reconstruct what he was reading.
Thank you.
And John, your question may be completely different, which is fine.
Yeah. Well, first, Emma, once again, congratulations. It was a great pleasure reading the book and hearing your presentation. I have 3 areas of conversation that emerged in reading the book, which I believe I can very succinctly present. The first is the 1910s and the 1920s were a notable moment of Ganda diplomacy around the world. There were ways in which Ganda diplomats were working in London, working in Rome, working in Tanzania, in Kenya, among other places. And I wondered by the 1920s if we have a sense if Kabaka Daudi Chwa was trying to control the type of work that Kivebulaya was doing in Eastern Congo. Were there ways in which he is kind of co-opted as a political emissary for the Kingdom of Uganda? The second question concerns the First World War. 250,000 Congolese were conscripted to serve as porters in the First World War, and in addition to thousands of others who fought with the Force Publique. And I'm just wondering how he navigated this. In the Kingdom of Uganda, debates about porters raised much longer conversations about Indian Ocean slavery. And I'm wondering if those conversations were resurrected in the Congo in the context of the First World War. And last, which is similar to David Maxwell's question about readership, do we know anything about British readership of these biographies that were being written in the 1930s? So Albert Lloyd's Apollo the Pathfinder, do we have a sense of how well circulated it was among British readers? Thank you very much.
Right, fantastic. Okay. Very historically interesting questions, John. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are excellent sets of questions. Thank you so much. So readership and its washback. It's limited. The knowledge I've been able to find out about what Kivebulaya was reading is limited. We do know that he was reading Apolo Kagwa. So we have an account of him reading the Kings of the Buganda, so imbibing this, proud stories of Buganda history. We know that he spent a lot of time reading the 39 Articles and committing them to memory. So, impressive Anglican credentials there. And then we have these notes that I think must have been taken at training sessions, so maybe conferences. I mean, there's a number of events where he might have noted these things down, or they may have made aide-memoirs for what he taught. And then we get early church fathers, we get history of Rome, the Roman Empire. It's very, very difficult to work out. And I haven't put it in the source book for reasons that I explain, because it's a bit of a minefield. But that's about all. So there is the sense that he's self-taught, that he was reading in Luganda. As far as we're aware, his English was never good enough to read in English, or only simply. I mean, he clearly knew some English words, but he didn't operate in English. He knew some Swahili, but mainly...
Does he have a Luganda Bible?
Yes, Luganda Bible, because that was translated. I mean, the translation of that finished in about 1897.
Was there a Pygmy Bible?
He was writing the Pygmy Bible. So one of the interesting things is, so he learns Lutoro, and it takes a while for the Lutoro literacy to develop, because so much is happening in Luganda. So he's working Lutoro. He helps on a Conjo Bible, but I don't know how much. And he translates the first gospel from what he calls Lumbuti, and it's Edwin Smith, interestingly.
Oh, and we've got John Young, the biographer of Edwin Smith, here further down the screen. Anyhow, Edwin Smith, what did he do?
Well,
let me hear Emma. Sorry, let me hear Emma.
Oh, well, I'd quite like to hear John, but maybe later. Edwin Smith works at this...
With the British and Foreign Bible Society. Yeah.
When he was at the British Foreign Bible Society, works with Apollo's translation and works out what it's like. I mean, it's the most extraordinary document that I've seen. It's like, what people used to do before Sudoku, who had this amazing linguistic, knowledge, working it all out. So the answer, David, is rather unsatisfactory, I think, to go back to your question. There is a lot I think we will not know, but we have some clues. to go to John's questions and their complex, I do think that definitely when Apollo dies, I mean, we might find more if I'd gone further into Luganda sources, but I kind of ran out of steam a bit. But it's clear that when Kivebulaya dies, he is this Buganda figure that people are very proud about, and the fact that he's written about in all these newspapers and magazines at the time of his death, and they're following him, they know he's going to die, and they're getting reports back about the end of his days, shows you what significant he is. And there's a statement which says, and he became, he's kind of made us known across the world because everybody knows about Kivebulaya. But how far this flourishing of kind of international relations with Dowdy Chua and so forth, how far he's part of that, I simply couldn't tell you. There were lots of loose ends and who was writing to him and that kind of thing that I just, despite my best efforts, couldn't find. First World War, again, big questions. I searched for something interesting to say about Kivebulaya in the First World War, and I think it makes 2 sentences in the whole book. There just seemed like a silence, and without kind of, lots of times I could have written several chapters on things that weren't said and things, going searching in all over the place for, leads on these kind of things. But my publisher very sensibly said it's long enough. So, I didn't. But really very little on the First World War. How was it impacting those local communities in Toro, where he was? That you can find out, but what the connection was between him and Toro, very little. So again, he doesn't make it appear as if it's impinging on him, but as you point out, it must have done. The only thing to be said, of course, is with the reduction of Europeans during that time, there was more opportunities for African church leaders to take a role, and
it happens everywhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, and he certainly steps into that. So perhaps for him it was just unproblematic, but he doesn't tend to write about these big events anyway.
Were those Congolese porters from other areas, John? Or, I mean, presumably the Pygmies didn't go and become porters.
Not as far as I'm aware. John?
Yeah, so the short answer is I don't know entirely.
Right, because Congo is big. They might have been from the West, and yeah. It's an astonishing number. I had no idea that there were 250,000 Congolese porters. Yeah.
I think just to answer John's final question about the British readership, a lot of the biographies are published by CMS, so you get this kind of evangelical Anglican readership there. Not all of them. Some of them are going into Marshall and Sons publications, which is a kind of broader remit. I have no idea of numbers. Nothing popped up at me in the research, but the first book, Lloyd's first book, runs to about 17 editions before, 17 reproductions before it reaches its second edition, which he completely rewrites after the death of Apolo Kivebulaya. So it suggests that these books, I mean, they were Sunday school prizes as well. So Room's book, and he from the Bible Society, his book was intended for kids, Sunday school prize. We get little pamphlets that I think are used in these kind of ways as well. But there's much more to know about that.
That's very interesting that they're going to give a Sunday school prize about an African church leader, not about David Livingstone.
Yeah, well, yeah, they probably got David Livingstone as well.
Yeah, or Mary Slessor. Right, Ali Bennett and Michelle Liebst. So Ali first.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was such a fascinating paper. I was really struck by sort of the theme of image making. And I was interested in the image that both he casts for himself, and you mentioned his sort of sartorial practices and his clothing, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. But also sort of I was struck by the photographs that you included in the presentation, which were taken presumably by British missionaries, and sort of the image that they're trying to carve for him as well, and thinking about those grammars of difference and similarity. And how the photographs and his sartorial techniques speak to that as well. Just love to hear a little bit more.
Thank you.
You know, I noticed the bare feet and the
Yes.
jacket sort of thing. Michelle, unmute.
Hi, thank you. So yes, I have a few questions about slavery that are all sort of interrelated. Oh, sorry, by the way, Emma, thank you so much for that talk. That was just so fascinating, and I can't wait to read the book. And my questions are quite selfish. They're around slavery. So my first question.
On that sort of area, Michelle.
Yes, yeah, I do. So yeah, my first question is really about whether Kivebulaya worked with enslaved persons or freed slaves. I suspect maybe not, especially with all his work amongst hunter-gatherers, because hunter-gatherers tended to be, by my understanding, fairly well protected from slavery or the slave trade. But at the same time, hunter-gatherers are, in a way, kind of maybe the first anti-slavery activists in a sense, because in many hunter-gatherer societies, slavery doesn't exist because property doesn't exist and so on. So I wondered if any of those ideas sort of filtered into Kivebulaya's thought. Did he express any anti-slavery ideologies himself? And about you mentioned the interviews suggested that Kivebulaya cursed chiefs. So I wondered, what crimes did these chiefs commit? And you know, I wonder if they were maybe anything to do with slavery, or maybe it was something else that they had, any other crime that they had committed. Thanks very much, Emma.
Great, thank you. Nice to see you, Michelle. Yeah, Ali, image making, really interesting one. I mean, there is a lot of kind of curating going on here, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I think those images, I always find it interesting when we're looking at these images, what are we looking for, and what do we notice? So the barefoot thing is a really big thing when you speak to other Ganda. They kind of say, but he's got no shoes on. And I find when I look at, you know, show that picture to students, for example, they're looking at his relative clothing compared to the people of the forest, you know, that he's got lots of clothing on. But for the Ganda, he's wearing a kanzu. This is really, so he's wearing traditional Ganda attire. When I say traditional, I mean it was brought in through and developed in connection with the Arab trade some decades, perhaps, or a decade or two before he was born, but he became the thing, wearing this white kanzu. In that picture, it's kind of hitched up, you know, it's not, he was very concerned about wearing jackets. So that the stories about him wearing a red jacket, which I've written about, but I can't actually find a picture of him wearing the red jacket. Obviously,
that he should wear jackets, you mean?
But he wears jackets, but it's quite common, you know, you see these Ganda people wearing very, very nice jackets. The one in that picture looks a bit tatty. But apparently one of the chiefs in Buganda sent him a jacket every year. And that although his clothing, one of the other Ganda church workers said that actually, although his clothing was threadbare, he looked after it very, very carefully. And he was very proud of this. It seemed, and church teachers were expected to at least wear a strip of calico across them, and then they started wearing kanzu. We have no record of him insisting upon that, for example, for the Mbuti. It seems that he didn't think that he should change their way of life.
Right. So unlike what happens, say, in the kind of thing I saw, there's no push to dress them.
Not, I mean, there was in other
from him,
but not from him. Not as far as we can tell. Everything suggests that he didn't do that.
And he's saying they don't have to settle down and go to school. So it's so unlike 19th century British missionaries. Yeah.
Yeah, and also he really likes their creation myths, and he sees that they actually understand. So he tells the people of Mboga that the hunter-gatherers understand God better than they do, because he thinks their creation myths are closer to those of Genesis.
So what are the people of Imboga? Excuse my ignorance.
Yeah, no, they're often called the Hema, and they are they speak Runyoro Rutoro, or a form of Runyoro Rutoro, and they
Right.
moved away from Bunyoro, and they basically had a close alliance with Toro, or closer alliance. It's very complicated and quite interesting history, and so that's how
Toro, yeah.
Yeah, that's how Kivebulaya ended up there, because the chief of Mboga agreed or asked for church teachers in about 1895, and from Kasagama, because of that sort of a client relationship there. To answer Michelle's questions on slavery, I mean, it's really interesting. I think there is a sense that I think it's very plausible that Kivebulaya's, as a young man, Kivebulaya's freedom was restricted in some way.
Right, yes, you talked about, did he have a slavery background?
Yeah, and he certainly became part of one of these bands that were changing their identity, but that had been slaving bands in Uganda. And he became so early enough, I think, this is my best guess, to have actually, been in some form of indentured labour. But we will never know, I don't think. But when he gets to Ituri, what he's concerned about is local slavery. So the Belgian authorities, their whole kind of why we're here is, to do wonderful things and to stop slavery. And that's very much what they go around saying, as well as, cutting off people's limbs for the rubber trade and so forth. But it's a very important part of how they see themselves. And the Hema kept slaves. So these people of Mboga had kept slaves. And the only way I can read the sources is that when Apollo first goes there, some of those people in the forest areas are enslaved in Mboga. He preaches against slavery, and the Belgian authorities are saying you couldn't keep slaves. So at some point, these slaves are liberated and they go back to the forest. They're not, as far as I know, hunter-gatherers. And they are the first contacts that Apollo makes when he goes into the forest from 1921 onwards. They were enslaved in Mboga. Now,
so he doesn't actually go into the forest till the 1920s.
No, I mean, he makes forays. I mean, because Mboga is kind of surrounded, it's right on the Semliki kind of plateau above the Semliki.
But he's working with the Toro in Mboga.
He's working. Yeah, largely speaking, but this is how he gets contact. He's largely not there until about the beginning of 1916. He's only there periodically, but then when he goes back there to live, he finds out ways.
Oh, he only lives in Mboga from 1916.
On a regular basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then why does he curse chiefs? Well, it's chiefs are doing bad things, like sleeping with the wife of one of his church teachers, for example. We don't know whether it was consensual or not. There's just no way of knowing that. So that's one of the reasons. They're becoming Catholic, which he doesn't much like. He's not very ecumenical in that way. And so that's why. And so he's leading. These chiefs, he says, are leading people astray, and they need to go.
They're not slavers.
They're abusing their powers. As far as we know, they're not taking slaves, but that it could be some form of coercion that he speaks about. And because we get this in the oral histories of the 1950s, where people recount this, Apollo liberated us from Chief Suleimani, but Chief Suleimani there was power plays as well. That's quite clear. That's behind this, as sort of politicking as well as behavioural issues.
Right. I mean, on those 1950s thing, what we haven't talked about at all here is spirituality and prophecy and miracles. But John Young had a question, and I'm aware we're already after 7 o'clock. John.
Am I stepping in front of somebody else? But anyway,
no. I see Jan Brownfoot, so she can ask after you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was really amazing, and I was so disheartened to see the price of the book. But the e-book, that has excited me to get hold of that now. I was introduced to African studies by Fred Wellborn at Bristol, and we spent about 2 years on Uganda and looking at African studies through that means.
And of course, Wellborn was in Makerere.
He absolutely was, yes, definitely. But the more recent, I had to look into Canon Apollo when I was doing Edwin Smith's studies, and Anne Luck was the most recent biography at that time, and that was done by SCM Press, which is a slightly different publisher to some of the others, but I can't really quite remember the slant she had on that now. Apollo got a fellow worker to work on this translation, which was actually of Mark's Gospel. That is the first Gospel, but usually you would think it was Matthew, but it was Mark's Gospel. And that created a great deal of excitement. Did anything come of that? I think that's about all I can offer.
Right, and is there BFBS archive stuff in Cambridge?
Yes, I went through that in Cambridge, and it is really quite quite a remarkable file. Smith got this, and like you say, people who've got nothing better to do, maybe, but he spent most of his spare time for a good length of time trying to work out what this language was, and he revised the translation in some way. Whether he was any more accurate than the original or not, I don't really know.
Well, that's fascinating, because the Bible Society side of Edwin Smith's life I don't really know about. I'm more aware of his Central African stuff. And can we just get Jan Brownfoot's question, and then maybe we're going to have to reluctantly draw things to a close once Emma's had a chance to respond. Jan.
Okay, thank you. An absolutely fascinating paper. Thank you very much indeed. One very simple question: where does the name Apollo come from? And secondly, we all have images in our minds of what it must have been like to hear Jesus preaching. Do you have any images or feel for what it must have been like to hear Apollo? And if you were going to make a film of his life, how would you represent him? How would you see him coming across? You know, as I say, I'm just trying to think of the various films that have been made of Jesus. So I'm just fascinated as to how you would see him coming across as a real live preaching person to this particular group of Africans.
Right. Well, thank you very much. That's a great question. My imagination could go wild. But to speak to John's question, first of all, I'm so glad you've seen those archives as well, John. It's a fascinating file. As far as I know, the Booty Pygmy translation didn't go anywhere. I mean, Edwin Smith was clearly not convinced of how good it was, and as you're right, that Kivebulaya, although he worked on it, he did actually have somebody who was working alongside the Pygmies and knew their language better and helped him. And there is this little kind of amusing thing that Roscoe is known for the Lunuro translation, which Kivebulaya started off, and he hasn't been given much credit for it. But now I'm not giving the chap whose name I do know, because I found it, but I've forgotten now, much credit for the work he did with Kivebulaya on the Lubuti. But as far as I know, it didn't go anywhere. I've never been able to find it. When I was in Congo, I wasn't aware of it. I mean, there was lots of things I would have liked to have gone back on about the Mbuti, and wish I'd paid more attention in the 1990s, but I wasn't able to go back to that part of Congo during, for this research because it was so insecure, sadly. So yes, I think it's a story without a resolution. that translation story.
Is there
I can tell you his name if you want.
Oh,
yes.
You have it at your fingertips. I'm impressed.
Yerasio Tubo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And is there a Pygmy Bible now?
Well, that's a very long question to ask, partly because it's what language do the Mbuti speak? And quite often hunter-gatherers speak the language that they share a language with the peoples next to them, and this comes out in the stories about who's claiming who as having the prior language. And the Mbuti have some very amusing and rather naughty stories that they understood things so much better than the Wailesi or whoever their neighbours were, and that they've copied their language rather than the other way around, which is what used to be thought. So I'll part that question because it's quite complicated.
And just as a matter of information, which part of Congo did you actually live in? Because didn't you teach at a theological college? Yeah.
Yeah, in Bunia, which is 75 miles north of Mboga.
Okay.
And is the
So not
provincial.
far.
Yeah, no, and it's the provincial capital of Ituri.
Right.
That's the area.
So it's not as if you were on the whole other side of Congo or anything.
No. I was hanging out. I mean, I hung out with lots of admirers of Kivebulaya for some years, different sorts, and including. I mean, the interesting thing is that there are still Mbuti groups. Well, when I say are, I should say were, but it wasn't until fairly recently. There were definitely Mbuti groups that still saw that their Christian allegiance came through Apolo Kivebulaya. So it's a lasting legacy. And so although it's very difficult to get their side of the story, and their presence, they exist as a community still.
Yeah. Okay, then Jan had these questions about Apollo.
Yeah, so
who would play him in a movie? Yeah.
So his name is quite easy in many ways. The chap in Acts who
Apollos. Yeah. Did Peter planted, Apollos watered?
That's the one. And you get this lovely description of what he's like. And I think that's where the name comes from. But I suspect Apollo was baptized Apollo because of Apolo Kagwa. I surmise, although we won't ever know, that it was Han Mukasa who suggested his baptismal name. And Han Mukasa was the secretary of Apolo Kagwa at the time. And it seemed like a kind of good move. And I think this is where you see these kind of links in time.
How much older was Kagwa?
Well, Kagwa wasn't that much older, but he'd been
an earlier Christian, or
a much earlier Christian. He'd been a page at court. He'd been among those fairly early converts, narrowly missed being martyred. All that, fought in the civil wars, led particular.
I used to know all about this, but I've forgotten.
Yeah, so very, very different in many ways, but here's these connections that they're making. The film, how would you project this? I mean, at moments I did think there are so many silences in this story. Maybe I should just write a novel instead, and then I could fill those silences with the best guess, without having to kind of explain it. But I'm not sure I've got the right skill set to be a novelist. But a film, if I had a film, I think what I would be trying to portray is this balance between the way in which Apolo Kivebulaya, I mean, I don't think he was a great orator or anything, unlike his namesake. But I think he was... He had this he did have this very extraordinary gentle charisma, and this comes through. People loved him. They just thought he was marvelous. And people talk about light shining through his eyes and things like that. So I think you'd have a very warm person, but a person who was also quite ascetic and quite demanding as well. So those people...
Sounds a bit Pauline. Well, I don't know if people would say Paul was lovable and light shone through his eyes, but the ascetic and so on.
Yeah, I mean, he saw himself as a St. Paul. He's following in St. Paul's footsteps. He's doing his St. Paul missionary journeys. Aberi Balia, his closest follower, sees him as a St. Paul. So all that comes through, but you do get the kids who talk about him in a really warm way, and the fun, the silly stuff he used to do, and the jokes, the silly jokes he had. But I also want to get along, there isn't an element of a performative element in what he does. And I feel like for all that he's pushing novelty and newness and this new way of engaging with the spiritual, how he follows Jesus Christ. I didn't say his inspiration. He has two visions of Jesus Christ, one early on, which I think absolutely makes him continue at a point when he would have wanted to give up, and then another one just before he goes into the forest. And
does he actually write about these visions? Or
yeah,
talk about
not in any length, but in about the longest, you get a paragraph which is long for Apollo on these stories. And it's a profound experience. And but for all that newness, there's a lot of the continuity which I don't think he kind of almost recognizes. And so he he goes into a village, he's it's a performance. He goes in, or when missionaries come to visit it, it's a performance. And he's kind of, you see this in the way that he's describing going about with a couple of the early CMS women. He's basically their chaperone, but they're getting these crowds of people coming to welcome them, and you get the same. Yeah, you get these kind of things. Same when he comes back to die, you've got these people carrying him, and you've got people coming to meet him on the path. And so in Swahili they talk about kusindikiza. I can't remember what it is in Luganda, but it's this kind of walking with people as they go away, but also as they come, and how that is part of a performance that works with chiefs, it works with travellers. Other people have written about this kind of thing. And so I think I was going to have to, if I was making a film of him, I'd have those very kind of visual performance elements, the bit before the titles start going up or something.
Well, I mean, Jesus ostensibly told jokes and was good with kids. And so, yeah. Yeah.
Emma, it's Joe here. You have a Ghana series.
What?
Still here. One of our listeners, he has nominated himself. He would like to audition for the role.
Oh, goodness!
Agana Nasiri Agana.
Yeah.
Okay.
We need to see your face, Agana, before we say yes or no.
We've got a picture of him.
Agana, reveal yourself. Agana is the first year PhD student at Edinburgh. I think you'd make an excellent Apolo Kivebulaya.
Right, good. He just has to go to the Ituri forest. Or you have to film it somewhere less Central African.
On location.
On location. In the New Forest. Wow, okay, that has been absolutely fantastic, but I think we probably should stop as it's 7:15. But Emma, thank you ever so much. It's been really terrific. And so...
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm just glad it was so painless in this time of snow and cold. And it's, we mustered, I think we got 36 altogether. So that was terrific. And you've given us loads to think about. And I hope people will go and buy your book in the e-version, if not the other. And it's obviously a great book to have for students, because there are so few of these kind of contextualized, thoughtful studies of Christian preachers. And I love the way you put him as a sort of bridging figure between the martyrs and the revivalists. And he's obviously a way of making sense of Ugandan Christian history across that whole period, as well as being such an unusual example of a transnational missionary figure for such a length of time. So lots that's distinctive about him, and lots that was really thought-provoking, thinking about how to write these sort of biographies so that they are meaningful and yet do justice to the person. So thank you very much.
Well,
and thank you all of you. And in 2 weeks' time, we hope we will have a good connection with Brazil, and we will hear from Pedro Feitosa about the very interesting Protestant missionaries he studied in 19th century Brazil when he was doing his PhD with David Maxwell. And so Pedro will sign in from Sao Paulo, and I hope you can join us. And if you know people who are interested in American missionaries or in South America or in the Lusophone world, please let them know, because I think we've only ever talked about South America twice. Carmen Mangian talked about nuns in Peru, and John Maiden talked about Protestants in South America, but in the late 20th century. But I think otherwise we've never had anything on South America. So we look forward to a very different set of issues then, but there will be continuities so as well. Thank you very much once again, and maybe people will see you at the Yale Edinburgh Missionary History Conference in the middle of the year. When do people have to sign up? I know you especially want younger scholars to take part, so I'm holding back. I'm not a younger scholar.
Yeah, call for papers has gone out. If you don't know about it, please be in contact. It's 22nd to 24th of June. It's print, oral print and digital cultures in world Christianity and Christian mission. So plenty of scope there. And yes, this is obviously new online conference. We're hoping to have lots of early career scholars put a paper forward. Agana, who you see offering to be Apollo, is also helping us organise it and register it. There'll be information about registration before Easter sometime.
Yeah, and there's a variety of ways of taking part. People can give a conventional paper or do much shorter presentations.
Yeah, again, if people want to give a kind of poster kind of presentation, we hope to do
like
that.
The medics do,
Yeah, I mean, this is just kind of us making it up as we go along on the online thing, but we just would like as many people to participate. We think that may be one of the ways of allowing people to show their work if we can't take all the papers for sort of verbal.
Are you going to have any plenaries at all?
Yes. So Alex Chow was down to speak on the one that was cancelled, so he's going to give the plenary address. But we've also asked some of the groups of our friends around the world who have connection with Yale Edinburgh to produce a 10 to 15 minute video clip as a kind of plenary. That's
brilliant. Yes, of course, if you do things digitally, but you were also saying that your hours would have to be restricted to allow the North Americans
and the Singaporeans. Yes.
Yeah,
and the Singaporeans. It's that kind of
right, that you've got to go east and west. Yeah.
So we are going to be using the middle of the UK day, 3 hours for the synchronous part, and we hope there'll be an opportunity to chat and so forth as well. And then there'll be asynchronous elements that people can enjoy, when they want to, in their pajamas, or I don't know, at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So
that sounds really good.
Yeah, be great to have people, if they haven't been to the Yale Edinburgh conference, kind of have a look on the website, see if it's for you, and but drop me a line if you want more information.
Right. Okay. Thank you very, very much, everybody.